The Cora, receptacle of narcissism. Let us enter for a moment into the Freudian aporia called primal regression, curious primacy, where what is repressed cannot really be held down, and where what represses already borrows its strength and authority from what is apparently very secondary, language. Let us therefore not speak of primacy, but of the instability of the symbolic function in its most significant aspect, the prohibition placed on the maternal body as a defense against autoeroticism and incest taboo. Here, drives hold sway and constitute a strange space that I shall name, after Plato, Timaeus 48-53, a cora, a receptacle. For the benefit of the ego or its detriment, drives, whether life drives or death drives, serve to correlate that not yet ego with an object in order to establish both of them. Such a process, while dichotomous, inside, outside, ego, not ego, and repetitive, has nevertheless something centripetal about it. It aims to settle the ego as center of a solar system of objects. If, by dint of coming back towards the center, the drive's motion should eventually become centrifugal, hence fasten on the other and come into being as sign so as to produce meaning, that is, literally speaking, exorbitant. But from that moment on, while I recognize my image as sign and change in order to signify, another economy is instituted. The sign represses the cora and its eternal return. Desire alone will henceforth be witness to that primal pulsation, but desire expatriates the ego toward an other subject and accepts the exactness of the ego only as narcissistic. Narcissism then appears as a regression to a position set back from the other, a return to a self-contemplative, conservative, self-sufficient haven. Actually, such narcissism never is the wrinkleless image of the Greek youth in a quiet fountain. The conflicts of drives muddle its bed, cloud its water, and bring forth everything that, by not becoming integrated with a given system of signs, is abjection for it. Abjection is therefore a kind of narcissistic crisis. It is witness to the ephemeral aspect of the state called narcissism, with reproachful jealousy, heaven knows why. What is more, abjection gives narcissism, the thing and the concept, its classification as seeming. Nevertheless, it is enough that a prohibition, which can be a superego, block the desire craving an other, or that this other, as its role demands, not fulfill it, for desire and its signifiers to turn back toward the same, thus clouding the waters of Narcissus. It is precisely at the moment of narcissistic perturbation, all things considered, the permanent state of the speaking being, if he would only hear himself speak, that secondary repression, with its reserve of symbolic means, attempts to transfer to its own account, which has thus been overdrawn, the resources of primal regression. The archaic economy is brought into full light of day, signified, verbalized. It strategies, rejecting, separating, repeating, objecting, hence find a symbolic existence, and the very logic of the symbolic, arguments, demonstrations, proofs, etc., must conform to it. It is then that the object ceases to be circumscribed, reasoned with, thrust aside. It appears as abject. Two seemingly contradictory causes bring about the narcissistic crisis that provides, along with its truth, a view of the abject. Too much strictness on the part of the other, confused with the one and the law. The lapse of the other, which shows through the breakdown of objects of desire. In both instances, the abject appears in order to uphold I within the other. The abject is the violence of mourning for an object that has already been lost. The abject shatters the wall of repression and its judgments. It takes the ego back to its source on the abominable limits from which, in order to be, the ego has broken away. It assigns it as a source in the non-ego, drive, and death. Abjection is a resurrection that has gone through death of the ego. It is an alchemy that transforms death drive into a start of life, a new significance. Perverse or artistic. The abject is related to perversion. The sense of abjection that I experience is anchored in the superego. The abject is perverse because it neither gives up nor assumes a prohibition, a rule, or a law, but turns them aside, misleads, corrupts, uses them, takes advantage of them, the better to deny them. It kills in the name of life, a progressive despot. It lives at the behest of death, an operator in genetic experimentations. It curbs the other's suffering for its own profit, a cynic and a psychoanalyst. It establishes narcissistic power while pretending to reveal the abyss. An artist who practices his art as a business. Corruption is its most common, most obvious appearance. That is a socialized appearance of the abject. An unshakable adherence to prohibition and law is necessary if that perverse interspace of abjection is to be hemmed in and thrust aside. Religion, morality, law. Obviously always arbitrary, more or less, unfailingly oppressive, rather more than less, laboriously prevailing, more and more so. Contemporary literature does not take their place. Rather, it seems to be written out of the untenable aspects of perverse or superego positions. It acknowledges the impossibility of religion, morality, and law, their power play, their necessary and absurd seeming. Like perversion, it takes advantage of them, gets round them, and makes sport of them. Nevertheless, it maintains a distance where the abject is concerned. The writer, fascinated by the abject, imagines its logic, projecting himself into it, introjects it, and as a consequence perverts language, style, and content. But on the other hand, as the sense of abjection is both the abject's judge and accomplice, this is also true of the literature that confronts it. One might thus say that with such a literature there takes place a crossing over of the dichotomous categories of pure and impure, prohibition and sin, morality and immorality. For the subject firmly settled in its superego, a writing of this sort is necessarily implicated in the interspace that characterizes perversion, and for that reason it gives rise in turn to abjection. And yet, such texts call for a softening of the superego. Writing them implies an ability to imagine the abject, that is, to see oneself in its place, and to thrust it aside only by means of the displacements of verbal play. It is only after his death, eventually, that the writer of Abjection will escape his condition of waste, reject, abject. Then he will either sink into oblivion or attain the rank of incommensurate ideal. Death would thus be the chief curator of our imaginary museum. It would protect us in the last resort from the abjection that contemporary literature seems to expend while uttering it. Such a protection, which gives its quietus to abjection, but also perhaps to the bothersome, incandescent stake of the literary phenomenon itself, which, raised to the status of the sacred, is severed from its specificity. Death thus keeps house in our contemporary universe. By purifying us from literature, it establishes our secular religion. As abjection, so the sacred. Abjection accompanies all religious structurings and reappears to be worked out in a new guise at the time of their collapse. Several structurations of abjection should be distinguished, each one determining a specific form of the sacred. Abjection appears as a rite of defilement and pollution in the paganism that accompanies societies with a dominant or surviving matrilinear character. It takes on the form of the exclusion of a substance, nutritive or linked to sexuality, the execution of which coincides with the sacred, since it sets it up. Abjection persists as exclusion or taboo, dietary or other, in monotheistic religions, Judaism in particular, but drifts over to more secondary forms, such as transgression of the law, within the same monotheistic economy. It finally encounters, with Christian sin, a dialectic elaboration as it becomes integrated in the Christian word as a threatening otherness, but always nameable, always totalizable. The various means of purifying the abject, the various catharses, make up the history of religions and end up with that catharsis par excellence called art, both on the far and near side of religion. Seen from that standpoint, the artistic experience, which is rooted in the abject it utters and by the same token purifies, appears as the essential component of religiosity. That is perhaps why it is destined to survive the collapse of the historical forms of religions. Outside of the sacred, the abject is written. In the contemporary practice of the West, and owing to the crisis in Christianity, abjection elicits more archaic resonances that are culturally prior to sin. Through them, it again assumes its biblical status, and beyond it, that of defilement in primitive societies. In a world in which the other has collapsed, the aesthetic task, a descent into the foundations of the symbolic construct, amounts to retracing the fragile limits of the speaking being, closest to its dawn, to the bottomless primacy constituted by primal repression. Through that experience, which is nevertheless managed by the other, subject and object push each other away, confront each other, collapse, and start again, inseparable, contaminated, condemned, at the boundary of what is assimilable, thinkable, abject. Great modern literature unfolds over that terrain. Dostoevsky, Lautréamont, Proust, Artaud, Kafka, Celine. Dostoevsky. The abject is, for Dostoevsky, the object of the possessed. It is the aim and motive of an existence whose meaning is lost in absolute degradation because it absolutely rejected the moral limit, a social, religious, familial, and individual one, as absolute God. Abjection then wavers between the fading away of all meaning and all humanity, burnt as by the flames of a conflagration, and the ecstasy of an ego that, having lost its other and its objects, reaches, at the precise moment of this suicide, the height of harmony with the promised land. Equally abject are Verkovensky and Kirillov, murder and suicide. A big fire at night always produces an exciting and exhilarating effect. This explains the attraction of fireworks. But in the case of fireworks, the graceful and regular shape of the flames and the complete immunity from danger produce a light and playful effect comparable to the effect of a glass of champagne. A real fire is quite another matter. There, the horror and a certain sense of personal danger, combined with the well-known exhilarating effect of a fire at night, produce in the spectator, not, of course, in one whose house has burnt down. A certain shock to the brain and, as it were, a challenge to his own destructive instincts, which, alas, lie buried in the soul of even the meekest and most domesticated official of the lowest grade. This grim sensation is almost always delightful. I really don't know if it is possible to watch a fire without some enjoyment. There are seconds, they come 5 or 6 at a time, when you suddenly feel the presence of eternal harmony in all its fullness. It is nothing earthly. I don't mean that it is heavenly, but a man in his earthly semblance can't endure it. He has to undergo a physical change or die. This feeling is clear and unmistakable. It is as though you suddenly apprehended all nature and suddenly said, "Yes, it is true, it is good." What is so terrifying about it is that it is so terribly clear and such gladness. If it went on for more than 5 seconds, the soul could not endure it and must perish. In those 5 seconds, I live through a lifetime, and I am ready to give my life for them, for it's worth it. To be able to endure it for 10 seconds, you would have to undergo a physical change. I think man ought to stop begetting children. What do you want children for? What do you want mental development if your goal has been attained? It is said in the gospel that in the resurrection they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are the angels of God in heaven. It's a hint. Is your wife giving birth to a baby? Verkhovensky is abject because of his clammy, cunning appeal to ideals that no longer exist, from the moment when prohibition, call it God, is lacking. Stavrogin is perhaps less so, for his immoralism admits of laughter and refusal, something artistic, a cynical and gratuitous expenditure that obviously becomes capitalized for the benefit of private narcissism, but does not serve an arbitrary exterminating power. It is possible to be cynical without being irremediably abject. Abjection, on the other hand, is always brought about by that which attempts to get along with trampled down law. He's got everything perfect in his notebook, Verkhovensky went on. Spying. Every member of the society spies on the others, and he is obliged to inform against them. Everyone belongs to all the others, and all belong to everyone. All are slaves and equals in slavery. In extreme cases, slander and murder, but above all, equality. To begin with, the level of education, science, and accomplishment is lowered. A high level of scientific thought and accomplishment is open only to men of the highest abilities. Men of the highest ability have always seized the power and become autocrats. Such men cannot help being autocrats, and they've always done more harm than good. They are either banished or executed. A Cicero will have his tongue cut out. Copernicus will have his eyes gouged out. A Shakespeare will be stoned. There you have Shigalyov's doctrine. Slaves must be equal. Without despotism, there never has been any freedom or equality. But in a herd, there is bound to be equality. There is the Shigalyov doctrine for you. Ha ha ha. You think it's strange? I am for the Shigalyov doctrine. Dostoevsky has x-rayed sexual, moral, and religious abjection, displaying it as collapse of paternal laws. Is not the world of the possessed a world of fathers who are either repudiated, bogus, or dead, where matriarchs lusting for power hold sway, ferocious fetishes, but nonetheless phantom-like? And by symbolizing the abject, through a masterful delivery of the jouissance produced by uttering it, Dostoevsky has delivered himself of that ruthless maternal burden. But it is with Proust that we find the most immediately erotic, sexual, and desiring mainspring of abjection. And it is with Joyce that we shall discover that the feminine body, the maternal body, in its most unsignifiable, unsymbolizable aspect, shores up in the individual the fantasy of the loss in which he is engulfed or becomes inebriated, for want of the ability to name an object of desire. Proust. Abjection, recognized as inherent in the mellow and impossible alteration of the ego, hence recognized as welded to narcissism, has, in Proust, something domesticated about it. Without belonging to the realm of one's own clean and proper, or of the self-evident, it constitutes a scandal of which one has to acknowledge, if not the banality, at least the secrets of a telltale snob. Abjection, with Proust, is fashionable, if not social. It is the foul lining of society. That may be why he furnishes the only modern example, certified by dictionaries, of the use of the word abject, with the weak meaning it has in French at the end of the 18th century. In those regions that were almost slums, what a modest existence, abject, if you please, but delightful. Nourished by tranquility and happiness, he would have consented to lead indefinitely. Proust writes that if the object of desire is real, it can only rest upon the abject, which is impossible to fulfill. The object of love then becomes unmentionable, a double of the subject, similar to it, but improper, because inseparable from an impossible identity. Loving desire is thus felt as an inner fold within that impossible identity, as an accident of narcissism, object, painful alteration, delightfully and dramatically condemned to find the other in the same sex only. As if one acceded to the truth, to the abject truth of sexuality, only through homosexuality. Sodom and Gomorrah, the cities of the plain. I had not even cause to regret my not having arrived in the shop until several minutes had elapsed. For from what I heard first at Jupian's shop, which was only a series of inarticulate sounds, I imagined that few words had been exchanged. It is true that these sounds were so violent that if one said had not always been taken up an octave higher by a parallel plaint, I might have thought that one person was strangling another within a few feet of me, and that subsequently the murderer and his resuscitated victim were taking a bath to wash away the traces of the crime. I concluded from this later on that there is another thing as vociferous as pain, namely pleasure, especially when there is added to it, failing the fear of an eventual parturition, which could not be present in this case, despite the hardly convincing example in the Golden Legend, an immediate afterthought of cleanliness. Compared to this one, the orgy in Sade, meshing with a gigantic philosophy, be it that of the boudoir, had nothing abject about it. Methodical, rhetorical, and from that point of view, regular, it broadens meaning, body, and universe, but is not at all exorbitant. Everything is nameable for it. The whole is nameable. Sade's scene integrates. It allows for no other, no unthinkable, nothing heterogeneous. Rational and optimistic, it does not exclude. That means that it does not recognize a sacred, and in that sense it is the anthropological and rhetorical acme of atheism. Proustian writing, to the contrary, never gives up a judging prerogative, perhaps a biblical one, which spits, banishes, shares out, or condemns. Land it is in relation to it, with it and against it, that the web of Proust's sentence, memory, sexuality, and morality is elaborated, infinitely spinning together differences, sexes, classes, races, into a homogeneity that consists only in signs, a fragile net stretched over an abyss of incompatibilities, rejections, and objections. Desire and signs, with Proust, weave the infinite cloth that does not hide but causes the subdued foulness to appear. As lapse, discomfort, shame, or blunder, as permanent threat, in short, to the homogenizing rhetoric that the writer composes against and with the abject. Joyce. How dazzling, unending, eternal, and so weak, so insignificant, so sickly, is the rhetoric of Joycean language. Far from preserving us from the abject, Joyce causes it to break out in what he sees as prototype of literary utterance, Molly's monologue. If that monologue spreads out the abject, it is not because there is a woman speaking, but because, from a jar, the writer approaches the hysterical body so that it might speak, so that he might speak, using it as springboard of what eludes speech and turns out to be the hand-to-hand struggle of one woman with another, her mother, of course, the absolute because primeval, seat of the impossible, of the excluded, the outside of meaning, the abject, atopia. The woman hides it not to give all the trouble they do. Yes, he came somewhere, I'm sure, by his appetite anyway. Love it's not, or he'd be off his feed thinking of her. So either it was one of those night women, if it was down there, he was really, and the hotel story he made up a pack of lies to hide it, planning it. Heinz kept me. Who did I meet? Ah, yes, I met. Do you remember? Menton. And who else? Who? Let me see. That big baby face. I saw him, and he not long married, flirting with a young girl at Poole's Muriorama, and turned my back on him when he slinked out, looking quite conscious what harm, but he had the impudence to make up to me one time. Well done to him. Mouth almighty, and his boiled eyes of all the big stupos I ever met, and that's called a solicitor. Only, for I hate having a long wrangle in bed, or else, if it's not that, it's some little bitch or other he got in with somewhere, or picked up on the sly, if they only knew him as well as I do. Yes, because the day before yesterday he was scribbling something, a letter, when I came into the front room for the matches to show him Dignam's death. The abject here does not reside in the thematic of masculine sexuality as Molly might see it, not even in the fascinated horror that the other women, sketched out in back of the men, imbue the speaker with. The abject lies beyond the themes, and for Joyce generally, in the way one speaks. It is verbal communication. It is the word that discloses the abject. But at the same time, the word alone purifies from the abject, And that is what Joyce seems to say when he gives back to the masterly rhetoric that his work in progress constitutes full powers against abjection. A single catharsis, the rhetoric of the pure signifier of music and letters, Finnegan's Wake. Celine's journey to the end of his night will also encounter rhythm and music as being the only way out, the ultimate sublimation of the unsignifiable. Contrary to Joyce, however, Celine will not find salvation in it. Again carrying out a rejection without redemption, himself forfeited, Celine will become, body and tongue, the apogee of that moral, political, and stylistic revulsion that brands our tide. A time that seems to have, for a century now, gone into unending labor pains. The enchantment will have to wait for some other time, always and forever.